Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Andrew Schulz, Department Head and Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Oregon. Professor Schulz specializes in 18th and 19th century European art, the art of Spain and its world from 1500 to the early 20th century, and the history of printmaking. Much of his published work has focused on Francisco Goya, culminating with an award-winning book on the artist's seminal print series, Los Caprichos. His continuing research on Goya addresses the artist's legacy in the 19th and 20th centuries. During winter and spring 2009, Schulz was a Getty Scholar at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles. His research topic was the use of visual culture to construct Spanish imperial and national identity in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Professor Schulz recently gave a keynote address entitled Imagining Spain's Islamic Past, Revisiting Al-Andalus in the Early Modern Lyric and the Visual Arts. This talk was delivered at the 9th Biennial Meeting of the Society for Renaissance and Baroque Hispanic Poetry, which was held at the University of Oregon November 5th through 7th, 2009. Andy, thanks for coming to UO Today.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
I'm very excited to have our first interview with you here, and just around the time of this conference, so it seems like a great time to bring you in and have you tell us about your work. I wanted to start with a big, broad question, which is simply what drew you to study Spain's Islamic past?
Well, as you noted in your introduction, a lot of my early work was on Goya, focused around a specific artist, a seminal figure in the Age of Enlightenment. And I wanted to move beyond that sort of monographic approach and think more broadly about the period. And one of the challenges in studying Spanish art in the period I do is there really are few kind of great figures. Goya really stands head and shoulders above his contemporaries. But at the same time, what gets lost in that kind of narrative, which constructs this period as the Age of Goya, is all of the interesting work and interconnections between a range of institutions which were promoting and creating various kinds of visual culture. And so what I found was, in thinking about printmaking during that period, which was one of the art forms that Goya was engaged in, and a form of art making that is broadly interesting in Spain during the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a series of prints that really had been understudied, which was an attempt to document the Alhambra in Granada and the mosque at Cordoba, these two seminal monuments in Muslim culture in Spain or on the Iberian Peninsula. And so my interest really began with that print series, which is a series of plans, views, elevations, very kind of precise, almost technical architectural renderings designed under the leadership of a military engineer, which gives you a sense of the sort of outlook that's embodied in those images. So in some ways it was the opposite of what Goya had been doing. Goya, the great imaginative artist interested in the visionary and the fantastic. So it really kind of opened up for me a very different side of Spanish culture during that period. And from there, I realized in thinking about that one very narrow project, there were a whole range of other episodes in what I've come to call this rediscovery of Islamic culture during the Age of Enlightenment. And Goya actually ended up coming back into the project in an interesting way. And in some ways, working on a major artist, I think the impulse is often to set that work aside and to begin something else, thinking, okay, I'm going to do something that doesn't touch at all on that figure, but I discovered that Goya, in a series of prints that Goya made depicting the history of the bullfight, included a sequence that show Muslims fighting bulls, which is this very kind of interesting imagining of the Islamic legacy within Spain's kind of quintessential national pastime. And so the project has evolved into a series of kind of case studies that look at a range of arts, that look at printmaking, that look at painting and sculpture, that look at architecture, the decorative arts, and in a sense, I try to rethink through the lens of this interest in the legacy of Al-Andalus, as Islamic Spain was known, or Islamic Iberia was known. I'm trying to rethink the shape of late early modern or late late 18th or the 19th century Spanish visual culture. So it's a project, as is often the case, that starts with one idea and then evolves and grows into something quite different in some senses.
And very big from the sound of it.
Yeah, very big. I think this is also the danger of kind of mid-career projects. Early in one's career, there's a certain pressure to think discreetly and to think of projects that can be accomplished, within a certain timeline that we all live by in our profession. But so one of the luxuries then of having tenure and moving beyond that initial stage is the ability to think kind of more broadly and more globally. So I guess I've either fallen into that pitfall or taken advantage of that opportunity, depending on how you want to look at it.
I think we'll look at it as having taken advantage of that opportunity. And speaking of opportunity, you had the prestigious Getty Award last year. Which piece of this work fit into their theme for the year, which was networks and boundaries?
Right. So every year the Getty Research Institute invites a group of scholars to both accomplish their own work and to be part of a community that is organized around some very broad theme. And in some ways, this was the broadest of themes. My own work fit into that mostly in terms of, well, both in terms of networks and boundaries. But in terms of boundaries, it was that the question that I was looking at was, so how is the Islamic past part of the Spanish national tradition? Are these discrete things? In other words, there's this long period of Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula that lasts about 8 centuries, from about 711 until about 1492. And then Ferdinand and Isabel bring to an end that period of Muslim rule finally in 1492. And so in terms of boundaries, what interests me is the way in which in the late 18th century Islamic art comes to be recuperated and drawn into a reformulated notion of Spanish national identity. And so, for example, the Goya project I talked about seeks to integrate actually in a way that isn't historically accurate. Muslims never fought bulls in the way that Spaniards eventually did. But Goya's print series in a sense, argues that the evolution of this Spanish pastime is unimaginable without that period of Islamic presence. His print series begins with kind of ancient Iberians hunting bulls in the open countryside, and then the Muslims in his images transform that kind of practical act into a ritual one. And turn it into spectacle. And so I was finding those kinds of impulses among the objects and enterprises I was looking at. So that's in a sense how I fit into the theme. What was interesting for me was that it was a year where they invited a whole range of scholars interested in Islamic art in various ways. Scholars working on the Ottoman Empire, working on Orientalism in the 19th century, especially in terms of photography. And so it worked very well for me to, in a sense, gain a better understanding of a field in which I'm, to some degree, an interloper. I'm not really trained as an Islamicist. And I think this is also another characteristic maybe of mid-career projects when you kind of seek to take on new territory, new fields, integrate them into your own work. So for me it was a really great adventure in those terms, and of course the resources at the Getty were extraordinary. The library was amazing. They own the series of prints that I talked about, those architectural renderings with which my project had begun. So that was a great opportunity to look at look at those prints every day. And really, study them closely and look at them together with architectural historians and others who were there. So it was really quite extraordinary, and really helped me push the project along in ways that aren't possible when one is teaching and fulfilling other kinds of duties that usually are part of our professional lives.
It sounds like it did exactly what it was meant to do, and it sounds like a very productive period. I'm interested in these sets of prints that you were working on. I looked at some of your work and I saw some of the architectural drawings, and then you had one reproduction from Goya's bullfighting series, which is called the Tauromaquia, right? And you reproduced one that was called in English, "The Valiant Moor Ghazul is the first who speared bulls according to the rules."
Right.
So there's obviously a lot of different agendas going on in this set of prints. But I was amazed by the stark architectural prints, and then this Goya print, which was so full of movement, and the Moor he pictures is in full what we would consider costume, maybe.
Right, right.
You must have a lot of very different visual traditions to work with within that period.
It's quite amazing, and part of what first attracted me to Goya was the fact that this period is really a transitional one from, if we want to talk about artistic style, from neoclassicism to romanticism. And the two images you've just described really fit those paradigms to some extent. The architectural renderings were created in a tradition that goes back to ancient Roman kind of architecture, uses ancient Roman theorists, and was revived in the Renaissance. And so, that's very much a tradition that is governed by a very particular set of precise rules and notions of representation. And then, Goya, on the other hand, creating with incredible freedom, as you say, these very daring and bold compositions. The Tauromachia was very much of interest to the 19th century Romantics, who both were working during Goya's time, but then when Romanticism fully flowered a decade or two later, these prints were really kind of awe-inspiring to these, especially to the French Romantics. So that's part of what interests me is that diversity. And while it's easy to see Goya as apart from all of that, I really think he's integrated in it in a lot of ways. And one of the things I discovered was, at the time he's working on the Tauromachia, he reminds the Royal Academy of Painting, of which he was a member, that they had promised to give him a set of those architectural prints. So he knew about that and was interested enough to want to have those, which I think is kind of extraordinary.
So there's some cross-fertilization between the Academy tradition and the kind of romantic stuff that Goya was producing.
Absolutely. Now, Goya's early career, he's very much part of that academic tradition in some senses. And then mid-career has both an artistic and personal crisis. He has an illness which leaves him deaf, and his art starts to change both for those reasons but also for broader cultural reasons. And so it's really kind of a crossroads in European culture. And so, but part of what I'm arguing is that those terms, romantic and let's say neoclassical or Enlightenment, in a sense mask, a larger set of unities. There's this sort of broader interest in thinking about Islamic culture and thinking about its place within a broader Spanish identity. And so if we can set aside or look beyond, if we can avoid falling in the trap of just looking at kind of the visual evidence and think about what's behind it, I think that it's really quite revealing.
So it's not just renegade painters reintroducing the Islamic element of Spanish history, right? You talked about it being something that comes out of institutions as well.
Right.
And I'm assuming one of those is the Royal Academy of History, chartered in 1738, right? And even King Charles III had an interest in exploring the Islamic heritage that had come through?
He did, and this to me, it took me a while to fully realize this, but really the history I'm writing is largely an institutional history. About these various sort of state-sponsored actors, if you will. The Age of Enlightenment in Spain is really an age of enlightened despotism. So the kind of the sort of monarchic centralism, which had, in a sense, been invented by the French in the 17th century, is imported into Spain. Beginning in 1700, the Spanish kings are actually Bourbon kings. They're related by blood to the French kings, and they bring with them a whole set of ideas about how to organize not only finance and various other aspects of state, but also culture as well. So Louis XIV is in some ways the source of these ideas, and Charles III, who's the king from during the 1760s to the late 1780s, really fully realizes these ambitions which had been begun by his father, who was the first of these Spanish Bourbon kings. And so, it's during this period, the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, the Royal Academy of History, these institutions are founded. And what's at stake, I think, for both of those institutions, and what I think has really not been recognized quite so clearly, is that both of them are interested in writing Spanish history, but from slightly different angles. And so there's a sense of almost competition between them, and then they kind of figure out how to sort of divide this territory. And so what happens in the case of the Islamic legacy is that there's a project that's begun by the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, and it leads to that series of architectural prints we've been alluding to. But the Royal Academy of History is drawn into this as well, because the Academy of History has been collecting inscriptions And inscriptions were a very important part of how history was reconstructed in the 18th century and other periods as well. And this great treasure trove of inscriptions was found in some of these Islamic monuments, especially the Alhambra, the walls of which are covered with Arabic inscriptions. And so the Academy becomes kind of involved in that way, and there's a lot of interesting kind of dialogue and back and forth between the two institutions about how to kind of coordinate their efforts. And a lot of members of one are members of the other as well. There's this small but very tightly knit, enlightened elite in Spain. And so there's a lot of kind of overlap between these institutions as well. And Charles III, in fact, becomes personally interested in the Academy of Fine Arts project when he sees the series of watercolors that one of the artists who goes to Granada to document the Alhambra. Actually, he's an artist who lived in Granada, so he's already there. He documents aspects of the Alhambra, including these vases, these monumental Islamic earthenware vases, which had been simply sitting outside in a garden for a couple hundred years by this point, and largely ignored, but gradually rediscovered in the 18th century. And for Charles III, what's interesting about them is that he thinks, and his agents think, maybe they're made of porcelain, and he was interested in the medium of porcelain, which all of the European courts saw as an element of cultural prestige. If you wanted to have a court in the 18th century, you had to have a porcelain factory and create these very refined objects that you would use, but you would also give as diplomatic gifts. This still goes on, this kind of trading back and forth of diplomatic gifts, but this is kind of the very elaborate 18th century version. And Charles III thought, wouldn't it be great if my porcelain factory could reproduce these Islamic vases, which to me, again, is a really kind of signal gesture and a kind of an indication of the very interesting ways in which Islamic art and the decorative arts were being recuperated. And I think in his eyes, these vases were a little bit like the kinds of archaeological remains that were being dug up in Italy and other places. And so it's in a sense, being involved in kind of their reproduction lends prestige, to his court and to his country in these very broad ways.
All of this is part of the book you're finishing, right?
Yes. Is
the book getting there?
The book is getting there. I'm in the process of talking with various prospective publishers, and it's. I don't know if you've had this experience, but I'm in the middle of realizing that this may be the most interesting thing I ever work on, which is both a great feeling but also a slightly melancholic one. And so I'm both anxious to finish the project but also kind of relishing, the small discoveries I continue to make. I'll probably be finished with it, I think, within the next year. There are various other kinds of projects I need to get to, but also various other kinds of obligations I have in the meantime, which make it a little bit unpredictable. But I think Penn State is going to publish it, and they have a very good series of books in Spanish art history. So that would be a nice thing.
I'm assuming if you go with a press that publishes art history that you will be able to put a fair number of plates into it, because this visual material is so compelling.
It is beautiful.
It's hard to imagine your analysis of it without the reproductions of the artwork.
Yeah, and that is one of the challenges. I mean, not to sort of talk too much about the publishing details, but academic publishing itself, as you know, is in a moment of, retrenchment, at least to say the least.
And perhaps crisis is more accurate.
Crisis might be a more accurate term. Yes. And when one is faced with the prospect of publishing images, it gets more difficult in some ways. Although, I think, it's interesting. I mean, I know the history of the book and the future of the book is something that you're interested deeply right now. The Humanities Center is as well. But I think it's one of those cases where the death of the book has been forecast for quite a while now, and it seems not to have happened. Maybe it's closer than it has been recently. But another, since we're on this subject, another avenue I'm considering is Harvard University Press has a program now with the Bard Graduate Center, which is an institution in New York City that focuses on the history of material culture, which in some ways my book fits into. They're beginning a new online venture which would make the entire manuscript available online in a sort of highly polished and designed form, but then it's available also in a sort of print-on-demand format as well. And that's an interesting model, I think, for thinking about the future of academic publishing.
Sounds like you're doing this at a time when you actually have a number of different possibilities. So
yeah, I think so.
It'll be curious to see what you decide to do with it. Andy, I was curious, I know you were away from campus all of last year because in fact you had a whole pile of grants. But I was curious specifically, some of which you had to turn down, I believe, in order to take the others. But you did spend time not only in LA at the Getty, but also in Mexico.
Right.
And I know that you were visiting scholar in Zamora, right? At the Center for Historical Studies at the College of Michoacan. I'm curious how working in Mexico influenced your thinking about the Spanish late 18th and early 19th centuries. Was there any cross-pollination there?
There definitely was. You know, it's a time in my subfield of Spanish art history and really early modern Spanish studies where it's impossible not to be interested in Latin America, colonial Latin America. You know, for a long time, peninsular studies were separated out from colonial studies, and that just isn't a model that makes sense anymore. There are too many interesting kind of cross-fertilizations, and especially in the 18th century, there's what takes place, and again, this is part of Charles III and his policy of cultural, Renaissance. There's what's sometimes described as the rediscovery of the Americas, which is not so much this literal rediscovery, but it's a kind of intellectual discovery, an interest in the botany of you know the American colonies or other kind of aspects, intellectual aspects. And so for me, you know, especially New Spain, that is colonial Mexico, is a really interesting kind of future topic, and I've been thinking about various ways of moving my research in that direction. And so that part of my year was in some ways a chance to write and to finish some aspects of the book, you know, away from libraries and other kinds of resources, which at times can be distracting. I mean, there are times when it's good to be away from the archive and to have a chance to really focus on the writing. So I did that, but also I spent a lot of time exploring colonial Mexico and thinking not so much about this project, but about you know, the shape of visual culture in colonial Mexico. Although I will say what's interesting is that one thing that happens in the early colonial period is an exportation of Islamic-influenced architecture. And so I also traveled a fair bit in Mexico looking at these Islamic-influenced churches and other monuments, which are really fascinating and have been puzzling to some degree. One theory about them for a long time was that when the Spanish descendants of Muslims were eventually exiled from Spain, which happens in 1609, perhaps many of them went to the New World. We don't know that for sure. But one theory was, okay, so this kind of architecture might derive from that phenomenon. But now it's thought that really what it has to do with is the fact that many of the immigrants to New Spain were from Andalusia. And so this kind of architecture was just simply more part of their broad cultural legacy because there's such an interesting intermingling of Christian and Islamic forms during the late Middle Ages. And so you know, that was kind of the one point of connection. But one thing that I spent time exploring was the academy. There was an academy in Mexico City that was founded, which was linked to the academy in Madrid, which I spent a great deal of time studying and figuring. You know, so some of it was just logistical. You know, how? Okay, so if I wanted to do my next project, you know, in Mexico, how will that work? What could it be? Ultimately, I found I'm not very interested in religious art. Which I always knew, but you know, religious Mexican art of the colonial period is overwhelmingly religious in nature. And there are a lot of fascinating questions and topics to address, but they're just not ones that, you know, I feel like taking on. So it did lay some groundwork for me in the future.
It makes a lot of sense that you should work by exclusion as well as inclusion.
Right. I think that's part of, I think, you know, a midlife point in one's career where you think, okay, I'm no longer going to do what I should do or have to do. I'm going to do what I want to do or what's interesting to me. And I think that, you know, that's sort of where I am with that.
We don't have a whole lot of time left, but I wanted to ask you if you could go back just a little bit to those Islamic elements that you saw in Mexican religious architecture. Sure. As you say, it must have been part of the vernacular of the colonial, the settlers who came over. What elements did you actually see, though? They must have been adapted to a Mexican setting.
They are, and frankly, to an untrained eye, well, some of them are quite obvious, but some of them aren't obvious at all. The obvious ones are these very elaborate wooden ceilings, which one finds in churches. There's some in the region around Puebla and in other places as well. But then often around doorways, one sees kind of interlacing ornament, which is a reinterpretation of Islamic, a very distant sort of relative, if you will, of Islamic ornament. But again, it's a matter of being tuned into it at first, and then once you see that connection, it becomes very apparent that it's there. And it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that's interested me about Islamic art of the kind of its influence in the early modern period is its connection to grotesque ornament, which is this revival of especially Roman form, these intertwining plants and animals in kind of imaginative ways. And the term arabesque is developed in a sense in Renaissance Europe to, I think, signal that connection.
Those elaborate intertwined hybrids.
You've seen them, I'm sure,
yes.
With sort of the heads of figures but not the bodies. And Raphael and others were very interested in these forms in the 16th century. And in fact, students of Raphael worked at the Alhambra at the Spanish court after it became a Spanish royal palace and created some of those designs. And so I think in the New World, those Arabic elements are sort of filtered also through that notion of the grotesque. And so again, there's this complex layering or hybridization, to use a term that we sometimes use to create these new forms, which are made by probably craftsmen who never would have seen the original. So they're strange and interesting ways.
I'm thinking that this may lead to another piece of work once the book is finished.
A fair bit has been written on this topic, but it is an interesting one. So we'll see where it goes.
Well, it sounds like, going back to the Getty theme of the year, that you were doing a lot of breaking down of boundaries yourself and tracing networks, so intellectual and artistic, as well as institutional history and visual history.
Yeah, I've been accused lately of being a cultural historian, which my friends in cultural history ask me why that's an accusation.
I'm going to stop you there, and we can pick up our next interview at that point. Andy, thanks for speaking with us today.
That was a great pleasure.
We've been speaking with Andrew Schulz, Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Oregon. Thanks very much for watching, and see you next time.